Greetings, brothers and sisters. I got a bunch of stuff to get to. This is a brain surgeon here who is going to dismantle the official story. We'll get to that in just a moment. Of Bob Saget, the autopsy. Then the Hilaria Baldwin got a haircut. And World War III. CNN shilling for World War III. And Hilaria got a haircut are all going to be covered today. So let's start here. So the title of the video, Brain Surgeon Further Explains Bob Saget's Tragedy. So this guy is an actual brain surgeon. And I'll show you his credentials in a bit. But it's Martin Rudakowski. And this guy specializes in these types of injuries, and I'll put a link in the top of the description box of this video because the whole video is well worth watching. I'm just going to show you little bits and pieces. And what this guy says in his conclusion, and you can just, there's so many holes to the official story. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure them out, right? But it's well worth watching, and it's, very clinical and very, scientific, and this guy has the kind of credentials and understanding specified, a specialist in this field that can totally dismantle the coroner's story. So let's get started here. So the guy starts off, reading the autopsy, and he gives more insight because I don't understand these terms, right? Like, I'm not a brain surgeon. I'm not a medical person. Like, I know that, the story doesn't add up with my limited understanding of this field. But this guy is specialized in this area, even more so than the coroner would be. He does these types of, he sees these things in his medical practice and field and studies this specifically. And I'll show you, again, his credentials in a moment. And, he knows what these terms mean. Like, I don't. Like, I had to look them up and things like this. And it's far worse. The damage was far worse than I even understood. And so he starts here.
Frontal lobes and bilateral temporal lobes. Now let's break those down so that you all understand how severe and extensive they are. I'll leave it up to you to agree or disagree whether or not the story we have around his death explains the significance of these injuries.
Yeah, but he doesn't really leave it up to us because it's pretty brutal. Like, it just, if you can't see that the official story is BS when you hear what this guy has to say, you should already kind of see it already, right? Like, I saw it. Just initially. I knew, and I just know they're going to lie because that's all they ever do. And who knows, if this is just a smokescreen to a larger cover-up with Saget. Who knows? Like, we just don't know, right? But, what they're saying is so unbelievable, and yet there's no media anymore. There's no, none of these things are ever going to be investigated by journalists or by, law enforcement. Lies, deep lies, obvious lies are just passed through nowadays. Even with the, with social media and a truth culture, everything is just, rubber stamped, right? Nobody cares. Nobody does anything. Nobody calls BS. It just, nobody gets to the bottom of things anymore. And why would you want to at this point? Like I say, why get to the bottom of things? I talk about heartfulness meditation, get to the top of things, right? Connect to God on a deeper level, don't dive into the cesspit, rise up above the low vibrational situation on this planet.
A subgaleal hematoma refers to a blood collection below the galea, the third layer of the scalp, which possesses 5 total tissue layers. In a strange coincidence, I just released a video last week explaining how this type of injury occurred in UFC 247 as the result of severe and direct blows to the head.
Okay, so this is, it's not a coincidence, right? Because we know about what just happened with this other comedian, which seems more and more like, why would that happen right at the time the autopsy is being released, right? This other woman who fell, whatever her name is, something McDonald, Heather McDonald, is it? Again, don't tell me, don't care, don't need to know. So if you've watched UFC, these UFC fights, like when I watched boxing when I was a kid and, young adult, I was always frustrated in how they would stop the fight when the fight was just getting good, right? When someone was going to get knocked out. There's always a lot of holding and grabbing, and, there wasn't much action. I mean, there's a lot of bad boxing matches out there, bad boxing matches out there, right? But then when they put UFC out there, and I watched people, like, especially women, like this would happen in these women fights, but, obviously more so with men even, where there'd be some person, man or woman on the ground, and they really couldn't fight back, and the person would be on top of them without a boxing glove, which is padded, and just pummeling the person, hitting them in the face and the head over and over again, right? And it would kind of make me, I just can't watch it, because the fight should have been stopped 6 punches ago, right? 5 punches ago, even 2 punches ago, right? The person's incapacitated, and the ref finally pulls the other guy off of him, or the woman. In women's even worse, right? And, because in terms of the bone density. And what this guy's saying is this kind of hemorrhage that Saget suffered is something he just covered with UFC and these, sustained blows that these, I don't know, I didn't see the fight, I didn't see his video, but we know how brutal UFC is, right? As opposed to the official story where they say Saget had a bump on his head.
A linear fracture of the base of the skull is a type of injury that only comes with severe head trauma. The base of the skull is deep within the head, protected either by the outside of the skull, the calvarium, or by the muscles and tissue layers of the upper neck.
So I didn't know there was a fracture to the base of the skull. I didn't even understand what I was reading, right? And the way that I understood it isn't the way that it actually happened. It's much, much worse, as he's going to explain here.
The force required to generate a basilar skull fracture is very significant and not typically seen with accidental ground-level falls. Comminuted fractures of the roofs of the orbits involving the bilateral frontal bone further attest to the incredible force his head must have sustained. A comminuted fracture is one in which the bone is broken into multiple smaller pieces.
So as I understood the story, was that he hit his head hit the back of his head, and it sent a fracture. It created a crack across his skull all the way up to his, eye sockets, right? His orbital bones. But what this guy's saying is there was fragmented pieces around the eyes, and the orbital bones there was, pieces of bones. It wasn't just one crack.
In a single fracture. And this appears to have occurred in the bilateral orbits, or the bony housing that surrounds the eyeballs.
So think about that. Like, how would that be possible from the back, from a blow on the base of the skull, right?
So far, this pattern of injury suggests that he suffered forceful blows to the front and back of his skull.
Yeah, so he said forceful blows, right? Not one blow to the back and one blow to the front, but multiple blows, right? This was not, a singular, like, oh, you got a bump in the head, right?
And the bilateral partial periorbital ecchymoses, or bruises around the eyes, are consistent with his orbital injuries, in addition to the basilar skull fracture. We frequently see bruising in this area from direct trauma to the orbits or due to a deep skull fracture, a feature termed raccoon eyes.
So he had raccoon eyes. Remember, think about the crime scene. I'm going to talk about this in a bit. But the cops are coming in, and this is what they're going to see, right? We saw this with Heather McDonald. And, this is even more suspect, her story, even though you can see her head bounce off the stage, that, some deep fracture, because what Bob Saget would have had to suffer was far worse than that, right? Where this is what his corpse would have looked like when they came in, and they came into this, what would be considered a crime scene. I'm going to come back to this. But then you think about, all the damage that this guy's saying happened here.
Mr. Saget had contra-coup injuries involving the bilateral frontal and temporal lobes. Contra-coup injury refers to the secondary injury caused by a ricochet phenomenon. When something...
So he's going to go on to explain this. And this is something I understand from, when people have head injuries, when you hit in this case, the front of your skull, the brain goes backwards because that's how, things work, right? When you hit a baseball, it's going to go in the other direction, right? So he called it a rebound effect. So the brain goes backwards. It's going to hit the inner part of the skull here. And so what they said happened to Bob Saget is that he hit the back of his head, and then the front of the brain sloshed into the inner skull, and there was a contusion there on the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. And so, this is a severe head injury. And this idea that Saget would have somehow bumped his head, like this is the official story, how they play, they originally gave it to people, that he bumped his head and wasn't, didn't think anything of it, got in his PJs and crawled up into bed, right? Like just think about how stupid that is. If your brain is, sloshes into the front of your skull, you're going to pass out, right? I mean, this is where you get knocked unconscious. Any of these injuries that he's talking about are going to knock you out. Like he got knocked out, right? And he would have woken up, right? And then, he was not somebody who, he was taking medication for anxiety and for worrying. They said he was somebody who was constantly worrying. He was, a neurotic person and very self-obsessed and obsessed with death and something, things like this. And he would have talked to his wife or whoever, he was closest to, or somebody, and said, wow, I got knocked out, right? He wouldn't have just got into bed. Like he wasn't, like he was that oblivious to the injuries he sustained that he got knocked unconscious, which he clearly would have been, right, by something like this severe.
These injuries are also commonly seen when the brain undergoes high impact under significant speed or force.
And so again, this guy's just dismantling this idea that Bob Saget fell and hit his head on the ground. And I'm not covering all that he says here. Like, you can watch this guy's full video. And, I recommend it to you people who are really interested in this. I sent it to my wife. We found it both interesting. And all the various hematomas and the bleeding on the brain, he covers all of it. And it's significant. Like, it's way worse than somebody who doesn't, I don't know much about this, right? So having a professional describe what, this guy found in the autopsy, again, the autopsy is the science. The interpretation of the events, the scientific evidence, the data, is what's questioned here, right? The autopsy could also be in question because, it's just so ridiculous. But, that this stuff happened. And, let's just go through the end of this thing. But it's severe, right? And it's much more severe than I knew, and I knew it was BS, when the initial reports came out, then when reading the autopsy. Now this takes it to another level of BS, right? Like there's so much evidence piling up here, and nobody cares. Nothing's going to be done. This is a dead story. It's going to go away. This is, probably my last video on this thing. I can't imagine I would talk about it anymore after this, but who knows, right? I can't imagine there's some more evidence that's out there that I'm going to find out about. But at this point, we all know that the official story doesn't hold up or add up. And we all know the media and the law enforcement aren't going to do anything about it because we've seen it over and over again.
So there we have it. These are not injuries caused by a bump to the head or simple head trauma. Nor would I expect something this severe to be caused merely by blood thinners or vascular disease.
So he's disputing this idea that because he was on some sort of blood thinners, and we know he had heart issues, that he would more easily have, he could get a slight bump on the head. That's what people are saying. I had a number of people who said they were doctors or nurses come in and back up the official story. And whenever that happens, I'm highly suspicious because it just seems, why would they be watching my videos? People I've never heard from before, and a number of them claiming to be medical professionals coming in and backing up the official story. I did this, thing on Monsanto years ago, and they had Monsanto had hired a bunch of internet shills to come in and spam people who did any kind of videos that were negative against Monsanto. It was so corporate, and it just seemed like it wasn't, it was BS, right? They weren't, legitimate YouTube viewers, right? And so whenever you see that, you have to wonder why they would put out a bunch of people to dispute the, any sort of, anybody claiming the official story was BS, right? And this guy, let's get to his credentials before we go to the rest of his conclusion here. So this guy is a assistant professor. He has a professional, he's a professional neurosurgeon, but he also works for the Augusta University in Georgia. And he's obviously really smart. Like he knows what he's talking about. This is a very clinical and professional presentation. And so you have these guys who have private practices, but they also teach, right? So this is somebody who has, connections in the community, and, he's putting his reputation out here a little bit. I mean, he wants to do YouTube stuff for whatever reason, but he's, and this is a way to promote it, his whatever he does, but he does brain surgery. This is his, he's a neurosurgeon. He does neurosurgery and neurological skull-based surgery. So the coroner is somebody who covers the whole body, right? And this is, post-mortem stuff. That's what he specializes in. But this guy specializes in brain surgery, and, he's going to know things that other people who aren't going to have this kind of experience and training are going to know, right? When you do a job day in and day out, you're going to see things and understand things that people who don't do the job are never going to understand and see. And he's going to come across various, head injuries and understand how head injuries work and, these types of things, fractures to the skull, the strength of the skull. He's just going to know all these things, specific things that are really important in Bob Saget's case, right?
These are incredibly serious and severe signs that major head trauma and traumatic brain injury has been suffered. In my career and personal experience, I've only seen injuries like this with high-speed accidents such as motorcycle crashes, serious car accidents, or falls from great height. Now, I have no idea what happened to Mr. Saget, but none of these injuries are in line with the orderly scene encountered by security when they first found him.
Okay, so if you're talking about, car accidents and motorcycle accidents and falling from great heights, right? That's the kind of force that he's saying it would take to do this kind of damage to the skull and these other internal brain injuries and, hematomas and bleeding of the brain and things like this, right? That's his professional opinion. But then he talks about the crime scene. So think about how this story was initially told to us. That this guy, Bob Saget, we now know that the cops found him. He had raccoon eyes because he had suffered some sort of, blow to the orbital bone or the nose or something like this. That's where you get those black eyes, right? I call them panda eyes or whatever. Two different things, though. But he had that. And all these different things that, all these different injuries that he had that would have fractured his skull in this way would have had external damage. There'd be bumps on his head. There'd be blood. There'd be all these things, right? So all the things they're describing here, for the force that it took to do this kind of damage, there would have been blood outside and there, on his hair, whatever it is, right? And so when the cops saw Saget the way he was, and then they brought him into the coroner, they would not have said, they would have realized that this is a crime scene, right? That this guy suffered some sort of, criminal beating, right? Or whatever it was, that, they would have not ruled that out. But they said there was no sign of foul play. He died, in his sleep. He bumped, and then later on it came out. We didn't know why, right? But then initially they said there's no foul play, right? And that, that was the official story. And we didn't know how or why he died. That he just died in his sleep, peacefully died in his sleep. This, what people dream about, like in terms of a nice, you go to sleep and you never wake up, like no suffering or whatever it is, right? Like one of these really good deaths that this great sweet man, who was a pillar in the community and, all these things, which we now know that even his friends don't even believe, right? But that's the story that they gave us. Then it comes out, they initially release, the family releases this idea that he bumped his head, right? But he didn't think anything of it because it wasn't a severe bump. He got into his PJs and, went to sleep and maybe he was on some blood thinners or something. And so because of, it's more easily, you more easily bleed and it was a bump and he didn't know. And, then the Heather McDonald thing was just happened. And, because of that, he, never woke up, right? His brain was bleeding and, it was just a slight little accident. He slipped and fell in his hotel room. No big deal. No big whoop, right? But then it comes out, well, it was a fracture of the skull. And so it's like, what? He slipped and fell and his skull was fractured. And then it came out even more with Sanjay Gupta. Like Sanjay Gupta was calling BS at that point. Like you could see he didn't believe it. but he was on CNN and they just go along with the official story. So I showed you like their initial reaction to reports before the official autopsy came out. And then Gupta came out and busted out his skull and said, what they're saying is there's multiple fractures and around the orbital bones. And I mean, now we're talking about a completely different sort of an injury. And even Gupta and these crappy reporters on CNN were looking like this is BS. But of course, they weren't saying anything. And then I read the official autopsy, and it's much worse than we originally thought. And then we find out he had raccoon eyes, right? You know, where there was circles around his eyes. And so there's no way, you know, when the cops came in, that was a crime scene. They would have looked at it as a crime scene because they know, right? They see bodies like this, so they know because they deal with coroners. And the coroner wouldn't have said, okay, let's just call this thing an accident before I investigate. I mean, it took them like well over a month to, you know, put out this report, and it was obvious what was happening with all these. When somebody comes in with raccoon eyes and, you know, blood and, you know, all these fractures and bumps on their head and things, whatever, you know, they should show pictures of what he looked like. There's no way people would say, oh, that guy just bumped his head, right? So the official story is a lie. We know it is now, based in his own scientific findings. And you don't want to commit to, oh, it was just an accident before you've done the research, before you've done the autopsy. And so, I mean, it's just brutal, right?
That's why this story makes less and less sense as further details are released.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to leave a link in the description box. Again, I only covered a portion of his video. There's a lot more that he gets into, and apparently he made an initial video about this. So there's a lot of information from a specialist here, but like most of us knew already, you know, I knew when they said no foul play and just there's just things that when you do something for a while, when you do a job for a while, you see things other people don't see. And in a couple of my videos, you know, I left this, I Googled Bob Saget autopsy, and I left that search engine and I'd refresh it every couple of days waiting for them to release the cause of death, right? Because, you know, initially I knew there was going to be BS. They had sort of hemmed themselves into some sort of a storyline here, right? And so I was waiting, and it said it might take like 4 months, 6 months, or something crazy like that. And so I was like, well, they're delaying this because they want the story to die down, because you know, there was a narrative they'd already put out there, and it was going to cause problems. They should have never said no foul play. But then if there was foul play, and then they keep this story alive, and I mean, he had made a decision that could have easily led to his death, right, recently, and then, you know, he had COVID and all these things. And so I knew, I knew there was BS here. And so I was waiting for the autopsy, and they slowly leaked it out. And family members, people have been talking about Bob Saget being a saint, the sweetest man his wife had ever known. You know, all these people were coming out, and Hollywood people praising Bob Saget. And this story is fishy as F, right? And I knew it without having the kind of training this guy has. And this guy just dismantled this story. And he not only is saying that, you know, this is beyond even maybe getting a savage beating. This is like having a fall, like, you know, jumping out a balcony or something, you know, severe, right? Like being in some sort of motorcycle crash. I mean, this is the images that he showed were even beyond him getting some sort of savage beating. Never mind tripping in his or slipping in his, you know, hotel room and banging the back of his head and going to bed and dying in his sleep, which was the, you know, that was the initial story they put out there. And that story does not match the damage that was done to his head. Like, it's just, his skull was wrecked, right? It was fragmented in places, and there was multiple fractures all across his skull. And his, you know, there was various places where his brain was damaged or bleeding and things like this. I mean, he was, you know, his eyes were blackened. I mean, he was, you know, in a horrible state. Like, are they even going to have an open casket? And, you know, what did he look like, right? I mean, I guess they already had the funeral. So where are these people that said they loved him so much calling BS, right? Like somebody like me who didn't really like Bob Saget, and, you know, I mean, I covered him in a negative way for years, and I'm saying this is BS. And I mean, I have a spiritual comedy channel here, basically, right? I'm not a news person or a journalist. Where are the people that loved him, and where are the professional journalists calling BS. You could see CNN, Sanjay Gupta, and Brianna Keilar and that other dude, Berman. They were all looking like this is shady as F, right? When they were, when they finally released the autopsy. But this story's just going to die because no one cares, in terms of the official people, right? The people who are the arbiters of truth, and they're not going to look into this. But I think most law enforcement people would be like, they walk into a hotel room and they're like, oh man, look at his effing face, right? Like they would immediately think it's a crime scene. But whatever, and that could be just a smoke screen for some kind of other type of death that they don't want to get into, right? And so, anyways, let's move on to World War III and Hilaria. Hilaria. Okay, so I got a bunch of other stuff to get to that I won't get to in this video. Hopefully, cover some Super Bowl ads. I looked at some of them; they all really bad. I haven't seen one good one yet. So, but I don't have time to do that today. But I do want to cover World War III, and I'll do the quick thing on Hilaria. Hilaria! And here's another version of Hilaria. Hilaria Clinton. Hillary Clinton campaign paid tech workers to dig up Trump-Russia connections, report says. And this is the right-wing leaning New York Post. The mainstream media isn't covering this. But the reason why I'm saying this here, when I get to the CNN report, which I'll do at the end of this video, and then talk about, impending World War III again. We'll get to Hilaria first, but this is going to be significant when you hear what the CNN people are saying. So I saw this. Hilaria Baldwin shows off new chic chick, new hairstyle. I like the short hair, she says. And so this is her Instagram page. If you feel like you don't fit into the world you inherited, it's because you were born to help create a new one. She's created a new world where Boston is actually in Spain. She's trying to pretend she's a change agent here. And so she thinks she's a game changer. And so there's some music playing here. And she's doing this little, just absolutely clueless and doesn't have the ability for self-perception, right? Showing off her new haircut. Her Instagram page is just her trying to show off what a great life she has, which is going to create hatred and jealousy and things among people who don't have, a husband who's a famous actor and worth $60 million and the glamorous life that she has. And, he got sucked in by this thing. Finish the chop. Get your mantra on. I'm sexy and I'm fearless. I'm divine. I'm unbeatable. I'm creative. I'm a feminine. I'm a masculine. Hear no evil. Speak no evil. I am not one to cross. They can talk that S about you long as you know that it is false. I am earthly. I am heaven. I am what I like to be. When I ask for what I want, somehow it find me. Somehow it find me. I am anything I want. Love you all. In Ireland, Ambassador Baldwin, no check mark, says she loves it. Dude, you chopped. Anyways, her inability to self-perceive how others see her. And, this way, her dream life, I think I covered this thing here before. She is somebody who faked a Spanish accent, which everybody knows now, and then tried to become famous riding the coattails of her much older, crazy husband, who she has brought down to ruin. And so that's Hilaria. Let's move on to the World War III. Biden warns Americans in Ukraine to leave, saying sending war troops to evacuate would be world war. So now he said world war, Putin has said world war, and Putin invoked this idea that there would be nuclear weapons at play here. And so this is the kind of rhetoric we're now hearing. And then I want to come back to this because, there was a bunch of reports and some official guy came out. I didn't get to cover this because, it's not going anywhere. It might be going somewhere, but not necessarily soon. But this is the rhetoric you're going to hear. that now we're on the brink of war with Russia. And so let's go to these CNN shills and listen to them talk about it. But first, I wanted to just say some clarifying points here, right? Now I have two CNN clips because I was watching CNN for a brief moment during lunch, and they said something here about false flags. I'm going to talk about that. And CNN's really pushing for this thing. And so if you think about what's happened here, again, just this idea of being suspicious of people who have been caught over and over again being liars and deceivers, right? And so we had the COVID thing. And the COVID thing got rid of Trump, and it pushed an agenda, and they got rid of people's rights to some extent or another. I mean, there's all this stuff that happened with COVID, right? And then COVID is, people are just worn out, and they're done with COVID, right? The economy's in ruins. They got whatever different packages that Build Back Better thing didn't, get passed, and they pushed whatever agenda they could through COVID. But now COVID's over. People are over COVID, and they really can't talk that much about Trump, even though they love to talk about Trump. And again, they're going to talk about Trump here with Russia because that's all they ever can, do is talk about Trump. They don't talk about Biden. They talk about Trump, right? But people have Trump fatigue and Biden fatigue. And so isn't it interesting that as soon as the COVID thing ended, they're back to where they were at the end of the Obama administration at war with Russia, like on the verge of, tensions with Russia, re-escalated tensions with Russia, because Russia war blocked America when America tried to take over Syria, right? And after Syria was Iran. And Russia wasn't going to have America take over Iran for various reasons. So they blocked this war with this military action in Syria, regime change in Syria, and America was not happy. And then Russia became the enemy, and Hillary Clinton was very clear about Russia when she was campaigning for president. And then Trump somehow won, and they blamed it on Russia. But over those 4 years, Trump didn't engage with what the military-industrial complex and various war hawks wanted with Russia. But now that COVID's come to an end, we're somehow on the verge of war with Russia. And when you hear what they're saying here, we're one step away from war, and then if we're in war with Russia, we're only one step away from nuclear weapons with Russia. And that's escalated quickly because before what happened in Syria, there was no talk about Russia being the villain. In fact, American and Russian relations had gotten better, ever since the Cold War ended under Reagan. And the other piece to this is, just keep this in mind as we're watching these CNN shills and all these things you're going to see an advisor, senior official advisor for JoJo Maggo, is that which thing are you more upset about? Russia possibly invading the Ukraine or a biological weapon in the form of COVID possibly being released by China? Which is more upsetting, COVID or Russia invading the Ukraine? Because most people are bummed about COVID. They're claiming that there are 5.8 million people, 5,800,000 people, almost 6 million people that have died from COVID. So it's going to get up above 6, I'm sure, before it's all said and done, right? And then all the other effects of COVID has had on lifestyle and everything else in the past 2 years. COVID dominating the world, right? And, the bat story and the pangolin story, I've been through that. Those have been debunked, and they were never real in the first place. And so most likely, and what I believe, and what they're not pursuing, right, something this big, something of this magnitude, and they're not trying to find out what happened. If this was leaked accidentally from a biological lab, then they need to correct that, right? They should find out, and they would know. They would find out. They just, aren't telling us. Or if it was purposefully done, either way, China, who is the culprit. I don't think China did it. I think that's just part of the lie, right? But that's the lie that they're giving. And so don't you think that, how negatively COVID affected the world, that the world would come down on China with massive economic sanctions and, possibly war and all these things. I mean, it's an act of war. And, what they did. And, if you look at the amount of people that died in China, let me just show you this here. This is from World Health Organization, the COVID response, the COVID effect in the United States. So they've said that we've had 900,000 deaths here. Now, we all talk about the way that they categorize deaths, but they're saying it's almost 1 million. It's going to reach 1 million here probably in the United States alone, right? Out of the 6 million people in the world, 1/5 of them have died in the United States, right? So it's close to 6 million, 5,800,000, and 900,000, 1/6 of the, probably a little over of 1/6 of the whole total deaths have happened in America. So that's significant, right? China, on the other hand, which has a huge population and where it's supposedly originated, has only 5,700 deaths, right? So if China is to blame in one way or another, and 1 million Americans have died, and countless other people across the globe, especially in Europe and some of these other countries, don't you think there would be some sort of, I don't know, repercussion here? That people would be more apt to be angry at China? I mean, come on, right? Doesn't that sound, bizarre that they're pushing for war with Russia, even though they've blamed China in one way or another for COVID, and China is the bigger threat. So this is just bizarre. So keep those two things in mind as we go through these CNN hit pieces. But first I want to get to this thing with the military bases. So I've explained this in a recent video, but this is, this is something that is so one-sided, right? So the U.S. has 40 bases surrounding Iran. Should they feel threatened, right? So Iran, which was destroyed, I mean, not destroyed because it still exists, but completely wrecked by U.S. intervention when they took down Mossadegh, which the CIA now admits to. They took down a good, moderate, modern leader who had the audacity to want 50% of the profits, 50% of the revenues from the oil fields that British Petroleum had cultivated in their country. And so the CIA went in and took him down, installed the bloodthirsty Shah of Iran, which led to this theocracy government they have now, and turned it into a regressive place. And now America and, their allies with Israel who have a stake in destroying Iran are completely positioned to go in there and take down Iran, right? And so if Iran had as many bases around the U.S., would we feel threatened? I mean, think about if Iran or Russia had all these bases in this area. So that's a meme I had for a number of years. But this is all the various military and NATO bases around Russia, right? All around the Russian border, of course, we have Alaska on the other side of Russia. And then there's all these military bases also surrounding China. So America is well positioned in this region in a much more threatening position. Here's a funny meme. It is, it's small. I had to make it bigger. Russia wants war. Look how close they put their country to our military bases. Right? That's a quality meme. And this whole area, this is blue, our permanent military bases. America has all throughout Europe and around Russia and near China, and then positioned out here outside of North Korea and Russia and China and these places, right? And so America, and this isn't even talking about NATO, has expanded in terms of military bases and first strike capabilities, and to go and, invade other countries is well positioned much more than any other country. We spend more money on war. We're the evil empire, right? I'm not psyched about that. It's just the truth that I've had to deal with because I know what happens to evil empires, right? Empires that go against the will of God, I know what happens, and I'm living in one. That sucks for me, right? So it's not a truth I want to know. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in tense 13-day political standoff in October in 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba, just 90 miles off the U.S. shore. And so if you understand where Cuba is, This is Cuba, and that's Florida. And they were trying to put in missiles, and we almost went to World War III. I mean, this is the potential that they could have, what they could have done here in terms of launching nuclear missiles in a very close proximity to the U.S. And there was a blockade, and I mean, this was one of the times we almost went to war because they were trying to do to us, Russia was trying to do to the U.S. what Biden now wants to do with the Ukraine and make them a member of NATO. And Ukraine is a Russian country, when Russia split up, that is, next to bordering Russia. And then there would be permanent NATO and military bases there ready to attack Russia. And of course, Russia doesn't feel safe with this because we didn't feel safe when the same thing was going to happen to us. I mean, we were 90 miles away from Cuba, Russia and the Ukraine. So this is Russia, right? And this is the Ukraine. And the Ukraine borders Russia. You can't get any closer to Russia than this, right? And so these are the countries that are closest to Russia. And this is even closer than Cuba is to us. So, this is something everyone needs to know about because it's right there. When they start talking about threats and all these things, this would be a threat to Russia and even to some extent China. It's closer than these other European countries where America has military bases all around this region.
They also deserve a significant amount of criticism for doing too little and too late. The senior policymakers didn't seem to come around to this threat until really quite late. This is probably not going to be enough to factor in or really deter Russian action.
So as we go through these CNN reports, keeping in mind some of the things I've already presented here, because I was thinking about these things when I watched some of these reports. I went back and taped them. So some of the stuff I haven't seen, but some of it I have, but it's all pro. CNN's really pro going into fight Russia, right? Which is completely messed up. But with CNN and these Democratic shills, all these pundits and experts, and that guy who just was talking about the threat that Russia poses by going into the Ukraine, it's much more of a threat to Russia that the Ukraine went into NATO, right? And what they accuse Trump of, and Trumpers of, and again, I'm not a Trumper, and I'm not a fan of Trump, and Trump screwed us all in ways that I've talked about in past videos. But in terms of the way that they demonize Trump as an extremist, and an extremist is people who believe that they're completely right and that the other side is completely wrong, that the other side is just fundamentally evil and can't be worked with, can't be, redeemed in any way. And America has taken that position. I mean, the media and all these people took this about Trump and Trumpers, and now they're taking this position about Russia and Putin. America is the country that's been most warlike in the past so many years. Of course, the Arab Spring, and there's always these fake reasons that we create to go into war. We are the ones that spend the most money on war. We're the most warlike people. And not being able to see the other side of these things and pretending that, Russia's just fundamentally evil and America's just fundamentally good is the same kind of extremism that they criticize in all these other groups. The same kind of extremism they criticize Russia for, right? This myopic, narcissistic view. And you can see it in these CNN hacks. Let's just get to it here.
Welcome back to State of the Union. A stark warning and chastising a bit from former national security official Alexander Vindman, who says what President Biden is doing to try to prevent Russia invading Ukraine is, quote, too little, too late. Let's talk about this with my panel. And Alyssa Farah-Griffin, let me start with you because you used to work at the Pentagon during the Trump years. Has Biden been doing too little, too late?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So think of where this started. Just a couple weeks ago, we were talking about a minor incursion, which, by the way, there's no such thing as a minor incursion. And then we were hearing projections that Putin was likely going to try to take the Donbas region, so the southeast portion of Ukraine. But now we're hearing assessments from Capitol Hill that they're talking about Kyiv potentially being invaded, potentially falling within 48 hours. So this has escalated dramatically quickly. And the idea that we're just going to send some troops into Poland and that is enough, I think is is a very flawed perspective. And I would note we still don't have a named Ukrainian ambassador.
The exchange that I heard is coming up. And, I was eating breakfast or something. I was like, oh my God, they're really pushing this thing. And you can hear it from this woman too. Everyone on the panel is like, Biden's response isn't strong enough and it's too late. Like they're really pushing for some sort of conflict with Russia. And you hear this advisor to Biden, and he's going to say at the end, and he says a bunch of stuff, and there's false flag stuff. Tapper asked him about. I mean, it's, bizarre what's being said here. I mean, in terms of the mainstream media and how quickly this has escalated into talking about war with Russia, which is ultimately going to end in nuclear war, right?
Disclosing the information that we're receiving as we're receiving it, and actually talking about the threat, being as transparent about the threat, I think has been very valuable, because now the world has been able to see what Putin is considering to do. The reason we know about the threats is because this information, unlike in many administrations in the past, has been disclosed.
What administration are you talking about there, Mr. Pundit, right? Because we know he's going to be talking about Trump here. This is the part that I saw. But he's saying, and a woman right before him said the same thing, that the reason that we're able to understand what's really going on is Biden administration is so transparent. I'm like, come on, are you serious, right? And that the whole world knows what Putin's up to. And I'm like, the whole world kind of is more scared of America at this point, right? America has been the big, invading force in the last so many years, the Arab Spring and all the rest of it. So don't make it sound like America, everyone in the world thinks America's a hero, right? Like Americans, a lot of us no longer believe in that BS.
And you also have a unified front with allies. But the fact is, and this is something that's very important, we saw this in the Obama administration. We did not see this in the Trump administration. But Vladimir Putin is scared to death about being isolated again. He's scared of the economic sanctions that Barack Obama put on him. He's scared of the fact that we can literally crush and cripple his economy, and he'll be isolated and alone. And that looks as if what's about to happen.
Again, they just love talking about Trump, right? CNN can't stop talking about Trump. But how does this person know what Putin is scared of, right? I mean, if Putin's scared of economic sanctions, that's what they always do. And don't talk about economic sanctions like it doesn't have catastrophic effect on children, right? Because we know from the Clinton administration, and, I've played that clip before, it's from 60 Minutes, where the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, admits that 500,000 kids starved in, I believe, Iraq or Iran, or I think it was Iraq, because of the economic sanctions. Economic sanctions cause children to starve in countries. It doesn't punish Putin. I mean, it does in a way by, alienating the citizens by, the suffering it causes on them. So don't make this sound like it's some humane act that isn't going to hurt children all around the world, and that you're a person for good and, righteous things and for human rights and things, because all those Russian kids, they're going to suffer because of economic sanctions. So don't pretend we're heroes and you're a hero, right?
Because now we're talking about someone taking a stand to Vladimir Putin, when the last 4 years, Hillary, that was the antithesis of what happened. After Crimea, Russia was literally simply a gas station with a nuclear weapon. The sanctions that were placed on Vladimir Putin crippled that country economically.
But
That's what Barack Obama did.
Joe Biden ran on restoring our alliances. NATO's going to lead again, and now he's taking a complete back seat in all of this. I mean, the Brits are stepping up with this kind of like trilateral agreement with the Polish. Where is American leadership in NATO right now?
I do want to move on to another issue, because we learned some new information from the New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman's new book this week that, quote, White House residents' staff periodically found papers had clogged a toilet, leaving staff believing Trump had flushed material he'd ripped into pieces. This comes as the National Archives says the former president also took 15 boxes, including classified information, to Mar-a-Lago after leaving the White House. And Alyssa, I do want to ask you, because you worked in the Trump West Wing, what do you know about Trump ripping up documents, or even, I'm sure you didn't go into the bathroom with him, but
Jake Tapper is such a tool. So, I mean, they shift to Trump. They're talking about World War III, and they shift to Trump flushing documents down the toilet, right? And I'm sure you didn't go to the bathroom with him. And so let's go to this other CNN report. This guy is some sort of advisor that's really pushing for war, and he's, delusional here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is bracing for potential war in Europe. The White House warning in stark terms this weekend that Russia is poised to invade Ukraine any day now. A senior administration official saying yesterday that military action that will cause, quote, profound damage to Ukraine and to European security is a, quote, distinct possibility as Russian forces with heavy-duty military equipment close in on Ukraine's borders. President Biden, in an hour-long phone call Saturday, warned Russia's Vladimir Putin of, quote, swift and severe costs if he chooses to invade. But the call did little to convince the White House that Russia will not attack. Those fears have led the U.S. and a growing list of other nations to urge their citizens to leave Ukraine immediately, as the U.S. also evacuates most diplomatic staff stationed at its embassy in Kyiv. Part of the Biden administration's warning is an extraordinary public declaration that they believe Russia may use a false flag operation to try to justify bombings and missile attacks on Ukraine. That is, the Russians would stage a fake attack on themselves to justify an invasion. That could ultimately kill tens of thousands and destabilize key American European allies in what Biden has said would be the largest invasion since World War II.
So he's going to ask this guy about the false flag, right? Now, false flag, if you don't know what that is, and you should if you're a truther, is something that people in the truth community believed a big event that happened in 2001 was, right? And so this is something that has been around there for a while. And when you talk about America doing a false flag, you're considered a crazy conspiracy theorist, right? But false flag events have happened over and over. If you ever watched that movie Princess Bride, remember there was this this King Humperdinck or something, or Prince Humperdinck, and he was going to marry this woman, Princess Buttercup, and that he was going to have her killed, and then he was going to kill her himself, and then blame it on Gilder to enrage the citizenry to go to war.
It's odd. But when I hired Vazini to have her murdered on our engagement day, I thought that was clever. But it's going to be so much more moving when I strangle her on our wedding night. Once Gilder is blamed, the nation will be truly outraged. They'll demand we go to war.
I think this is Christopher Guest. I've just talked about him and Michael McKeon. But anyways, even if it isn't, don't care, don't tell me, don't need to know. But that would be weird. But anywho, so getting the people, the peasants, to fight your wars for them is very difficult, right? So you have your military, and your military doesn't want to fight. I mean, your military, some of them, right, are just really gung-ho. But war is very difficult, right? War is hell. And so getting your people to engage in war, and war comes with suffering, and you might lose or whatever it is. And so they have to find ways to engage people, especially if you have a country like Russia that is militarily superior to the Ukraine, that Russia would need a reason. They would need to be provoked in some way, and the Ukraine isn't going to do it, right? It's like a normal person, a non-crazy person, provoking a lion or something, right? Provoking a tiger, right? Or, a bear or something, whatever it is, into fighting it and into, doing something so that the animal would fight them. It doesn't make any sense because that the tiger is more physically superior to you in a fight, right? Unless you had some sort of weapons or whatever it is. I'm talking about hand-to-hand combat here. But in terms of America, we have the greatest army and, the most money we spend on military. We have an unfair advantage. And so countries aren't going to want to mess with America and American military, right? That would be stupid. And so there needs to be some way to provoke a war. America has in the past done false flags, whatever you want to call them. And the American people don't want a war right now. And so they have to be convinced. So, come on, right? Like, we'll get into this here as Tapper, right? Jake Tapper goes through and asks this guy these questions.
That continent. It's a reassurance to NATO allies. On Friday, President Biden ordered the deployment of 3,000 additional American service members to Poland, which borders Ukraine to the west. Joining us now to discuss, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Jake, thanks for joining us. You said Friday afternoon that all Americans in Ukraine should get out within 24 to 48 hours. That 48 hours is almost up. Do you anticipate this invasion could happen as soon as tomorrow? And what can you tell us about reports that U.S. intelligence believes Russia is considering Wednesday for an attack?
Well, Jake, we cannot perfectly predict the day, but we have now been saying for some time that we are in the window and an invasion could begin, a major military action could begin by Russia in Ukraine any day now. That includes this coming week before the end of the Olympics. Of course, it could take place after the end of the Olympics, or it is still possible, we believe, that Russia could choose the diplomatic path. But the way they have built up their forces, the way they have maneuvered things in place, makes it a distinct possibility that there will be major military action very soon.
We don't care. If Russia invades the Ukraine, now America went to war with Iraq and Afghanistan, and then had regime change in Libya, and then, of course, Vietnam and various military actions that went on for years and throughout, various presidencies. And then they tried to do it in Syria. So these were 3 military actions. We saw the disaster in Afghanistan that was pushed by the Bush administration, Republicans, and then the Arab Spring wars in these countries that are ruined and the people are suffering, certainly in Libya and in Afghanistan and in Iran, and there was a sort of a military intervention in Egypt. There's a few things that happened of a smaller nature, but these countries are way worse off now, and America is worse off, and they were bogus wars, and we all know it. And Biden just had a debacle of an exit where he came up with some bull crap new, remember the thing that he said about this new variant of ISIS, remember this whole thing, and they bombed children. They ended up droning kids and didn't take responsibility. All that stuff that happened, right? His administration, these tools. And so for them to come out here and make it sound like we care about it, we don't. I don't. Like, what I care about is World War III. Again, Ukraine and Russia, I don't know if the Ukrainians would be worse off under Russia. I don't, they have a corrupt government now. That's somebody else's mess, and they should figure it out, right? And the Ukrainians and the Russians have a lot more in common. They share, ancestry and dialogue and language. When I went to the Heartfulness Ashram in Chennai, there were so many Russian and Ukrainian practitioners, and they always hung out together. Like, they were always together, and they consider themselves like one country, right? They were like, Americans and Canadians, but even more so. Like, they were just, I don't think they distinguished on a social level between what happened when they were split up, a few years back. I mean, Canada has always been a separate country from America in terms of, modern history. But the Ukraine just split away from Russia in the 80s. So, many of them intermarry, and they have much more of a relationship than, the Ukrainians do with any of these European countries. And so nobody cares. They make it sound like we all care about it, and we don't.
And we are prepared to continue to work on diplomacy, but we are also prepared to respond in a united and decisive way with our allies and partners should Russia proceed.
You've been warning about a Russian invasion of Ukraine since early November. That's 3 months ago. It does seem as though something has changed in the last few days. You and your colleagues seem more alarmed than ever. What specifically have you learned in the last few days to prompt such urgent warnings? And do you now believe a Russian invasion of Ukraine is more likely than not?
Well, when we began, when we began warning about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine in November, we were pinpointing sometime after the turn of the year, sometime in the January or February timeframe. So what we watched then happen over the course of November, December, January, was the buildup of Russian forces in both Russia itself and in Belarus, which is the country that borders Ukraine to the north. And what we've seen just in the last 10 days or so is an acceleration of that buildup and the movement of Russian forces of all varieties closer to the border with Ukraine in a position where they could launch a military action very, very rapidly.
See, the question that should be asked is, what would this mean to America? What would the taking over of the Ukraine mean to America? There really wouldn't be much. There's some natural resources there, Hunter Biden's Burisma, gas company, things like that. But it used to be part of Russia. So it'd be Russia taking back a part of what used to be Russia. And then, if Russia was going to invade some of these other countries, they know that it'd be totally different than invading the Ukraine, right? If they invaded Poland or any of these other countries, there would be World War III. And all these European countries and America and its allies would go to war with Russia. So that's not possible. Russia would stop with the Ukraine. If Russia re-annexed the Ukraine, it wouldn't make much of a difference to America. And, they have as much right to do that as we have. All the different governments and, elections that we've rigged around the world, all the things that we've done as a country. It's fair play, like I said. You can't say America gets to do things and Russia doesn't, or Iran doesn't, or North Korea doesn't, right? It's about behavior. We're the good guys, you're the bad guys. That's not, that doesn't float anymore, right? Especially with all that America's done, all the deception, like America's just somehow better. Of course, I'd rather live in America than Russia. I mean, there's people who are very happy in Russia. There's people I know who are very happy in the Ukraine. But we have a better life here, But that doesn't mean America's better. It just means that we have, won some economic and military wars and things that have put us in a better position, right? That we have a better lifestyle. It doesn't mean we're a better country. It means that, we have an advantage, an economic advantage and military advantage that has made our empire have, more perks and benefits and things like this.
That is also consistent with the information we're picking up from a variety of sources. I'm not going to handicap what will happen. I cannot sit here today and predict. What I can do is make sure we are prepared. And we are prepared. We are prepared to respond immediately and decisively, flanked by our allies and partners if Russia moves forward. We will defend NATO territory. We will impose costs on Russia. And we will ensure that we emerge from this as the West, stronger, more determined, more purposeful than we have been in 30 years, and that Russia ultimately suffers a significant strategic cost for military action.
World War III does not end well for America. It just doesn't, right? Like, you can see this right now, what America deserves. We're a divided country. We're an immoral country. We're filled with selfish, entitled people. We're extremely weak. And we have all suffered from our extravagant lifestyle and a focus on materialism and not connecting to God, especially internally. I talk about with the heartfulness meditation, an internal connection to God. And, the destruction of the family and, all this stuff, everything, just everything I cover here, right? America's an absolute mess. And we're just waiting for it. The inflation, the economy, everything's collapsing in America. And I think they think, this is some Hail Mary, World War III, war with Russia can, it's like a last-ditch effort to save, I don't know what it is, right? Or destroy America. Our military's completely weak. I mean, it's just, we're a mess right now. And so, he's talking tough, but I think everybody realizes that America is just like sitting up there like Humpty Dumpty ready to fall off the wall, right? We're very fragile and very weak, even though, we've been this economic and military power for years. And that's what's happening. So I want to get to this last question from Jake Tapper. But you can see that they're so arrogant and they're so, they really want this, right? I mean, everything that I've heard from them on CNN, I was pretty shocked at how pro-war these guys are. Like they don't have any clue at what's going to happen here, or how this is the end of America as we now know it.
You've been warning about the Russians using a false flag operation to justify invading Ukraine. That's a strong claim to make without presenting a shred of evidence. Is there anything more you can tell the public, a public that might be justifiably rather skeptical of claims about intelligence?
Well, let me make 3 points on this. First, we're not putting forward this intelligence to start a war, which has happened in the past, Jake. We are putting forward this intelligence to stop a war. And I think that fundamentally gives it, at the outset, a different level of credibility. Secondly, this is consistent with the Russian playbook. We have seen them do this before many times. You ask any Russia expert, they will point to examples of where Russia has used false flag operations as pretext to start military action. And then third, if you look at the Russian media, they are laying the groundwork for a potential pretext by raising the possibility of attacks by Ukrainian forces on either Russians themselves or Russia's proxy forces in the Donbass.
So I don't believe that they're not the ones pushing for war, America, right? Because we're deciding that the Russians can't do something. We're deciding the Russians can't invade the Ukraine. And so, you know, I mean, the Russians could have stopped us from invading any number of countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, and those were disastrous wars. And America, more than any other country, has a devious playbook of creating these wars and whatever, you know, whatever you want to believe about these things. But the bottom line here, you know, and there's some predictions and heartfulness, and I talked about Nostradamus, and, you know, it just feels like we're heading for this stuff, right? And, you know, things are a lot worse than people know about economically and socially and morally. And then there's the spiritual movement that is creating a new world where, you know, so much of this evil can't exist, right? And so it has to, you know, flame out in some way, and this is the way it's doing it. And so right now, like, they're talking about war with Russia, and it may happen now, it may happen 5 years from now, I don't know. But it's something that's on the table, and it's not going away. And if Russia can hook up with China or some of these other countries and make it more of a fair fight, and who knows how this is going to go down, right? But right now, America's weak, and, you know, war with Russia, then we're one step away from war with Russia, then we're 2 steps away from nuclear war with Russia, and then, you know, everything changes, and people won't have any, you know, idea how, I mean, can't even conceive of what a post-nuclear war world is like. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Paul Romano, definitely reporting from the Apocalypse and the Ascension. Everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.